The dust on Clara Bennett's lips tasted like copper and defeat, but she refused to stop walking because somewhere beyond the shimmering heat waves stood the man who had written her letters filled with promises of forever. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly before her in July of 1882, a landscape so brutal and unforgiving that even the buzzards circling overhead seemed to pity her foolishness. She had left the stagecoach station in Tombstone 40 miles back after receiving word that James wouldn't be meeting her there as planned, that his ranch lay further north than she'd understood, that if she wanted to reach him, she would have to find her own way. The station master had warned her against traveling alone, had told her to wait for the next supply wagon heading that direction. But Clara had already waited 3 months since James's last letter, had already crossed half a continent from Missouri, had already burned every bridge behind her by telling her father she was marrying a cowboy she'd met only twice before he'd headed west to make his fortune. Her feet ached inside boots never meant for this kind of journey, boots selected for their appearance rather than their practicality because she'd imagined arriving at James's ranch looking pretty and civilized, not like some desperate woman half dead from thirst and exposure. The canteen the station master had given her ran dry 6 hours ago, and the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, turning the sky into shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if Clara wasn't so focused on simply surviving. She thought about her mother's face when she'd announced her engagement. The disappointment and fear mingled together. The way her mother had gripped her hands and begged her to reconsider marrying a man she barely knew, moving to a territory where women died from childbirth and Indian raids and simple loneliness. Clara had been so certain then, so full of romantic notions about love conquering all obstacles, about building a life with James under western skies. Now those romantic notions seemed as insubstantial as the heat mirages dancing across the desert floor. Clara stumbled over a rock and caught herself, her palms scraping against rough ground, small stones embedding in her skin. She forced herself upright again, brushing away the blood and dirt, taking a deep breath that burned her lungs with its dryness. The station master had given her rough directions, had pointed her north and told her to follow the old cattle trail, said she'd recognize James's ranch by the cottonwood trees growing near a creek bed, one of the few reliable water sources in this parched country. Clara had nodded confidently, had thanked him for his concern, had set out at dawn believing she could cover the distance before the worst heat of the day. She'd been walking for nearly 12 hours now, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest, for water, for shade. Her traveling dress clung to her body with sweat, the heavy fabric entirely inappropriate for desert crossing, but it was what she'd worn on the stagecoach, and she'd had no opportunity to change. The carpet bag she'd been carrying had grown impossibly heavy around mile 10, and she'd finally abandoned it beside the trail, keeping only her most precious possessions tucked into her pockets. James's letters folded against her heart, her mother's locket around her neck, and the small derringer her father had insisted she carry despite her protests that she'd never need such a thing. The sun sank lower and Clara's shadow stretched long before her, a dark companion mimicking her increasingly unsteady gait. She knew she should stop, should wait out the remaining daylight and continue in the cooler evening hours, but something drove her forward with single-minded determination. She'd come too far to fail now, had sacrificed too much, had bet her entire future on James Thornton being the man his letters promised he was. They'd met at her cousin's wedding in Kansas City, had danced 3 times that evening, and Clara had fallen for his easy smile and the gentle way he'd spoken about his dreams of ranching in Arizona Territory. He'd stayed in Kansas City for 2 weeks, courting her properly, taking her on chaperoned walks, bringing her wildflowers, and telling her stories about the untamed country he was heading toward. When he'd proposed on his last night in town, Clara had said yes without hesitation, despite knowing him such a short time, despite her family's objections, despite every practical reason to refuse. He'd promised to send for her once he'd established his ranch, once he had a proper home to bring her to. And for 8 months his letters had arrived regularly, filled with descriptions of the land he'd claimed, the house he was building, the future they would share. Then his letters had mentioned the drought making everything more difficult, the nearest town being further than he'd realized, the isolation being harder than expected, but always he'd ended with declarations of love and promises that she should come as soon as possible. Clara's vision blurred, and she couldn't tell if it was from tears or dehydration or simple exhaustion. She forced herself to focus on the horizon, searching for any sign of the cottonwood trees James had mentioned in his letters, any indication she was heading in the right direction. The landscape looked the same in every direction, endless stretches of scrub brush and rocky soil and distant mountains that never seemed to grow closer. She'd passed several side trails throughout the day, had agonized over each decision to stay on the main path or diverge, had ultimately trusted her instinct and the station master's directions. Now she wondered if she'd made fatal mistakes, if she'd taken a wrong turn somewhere without realizing, if she would die out here in this God-forsaken desert without ever seeing James again. The thought made her angry rather than frightened, anger being easier to bear than fear, and she used that anger to fuel her steps forward. She hadn't crossed half a continent to die within miles of her destination, hadn't defied her family and society's expectations to become buzzard food, hadn't fallen in love with a cowboy's dreams to let those dreams die with her in the dust. The sun touched the horizon and the temperature began dropping immediately, the desert cold arriving as quickly as the heat had built that morning. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, still walking, her throat so dry she couldn't swallow anymore, her lips cracked and bleeding. She tried to calculate how much longer she could continue before her body simply gave out, tried to remember everything she'd read about desert survival, tried to think of anything except how desperately she wanted water. Every step became a negotiation with her failing body, a promise that she'd rest after just one more mile, just around the next bend, just when she spotted those cottonwood trees. Darkness fell swiftly in the desert, the brief twilight giving way to full night in what seemed like minutes. Stars emerged overhead in such abundance that Clara might have stopped to marvel at them under different circumstances, might have appreciated their beauty. But now they were just cold, distant lights offering no comfort or guidance. The moon rose, 3/4 full, providing enough illumination to see the trail beneath her feet, and Clara kept walking because stopping would mean admitting defeat, would mean lying down in the dirt to wait for death or rescue, whichever came first. Her mind began playing tricks on her, showing her images of water where none existed, making her hear voices calling her name through the darkness. She stumbled more frequently now, her coordination failing, her body running on pure stubborn will with nothing left in reserve. She thought about her mother back in Missouri, wondered if she'd ever learn what happened to her daughter, if James would somehow get word to her family when Clara failed to arrive. She thought about James receiving news that his bride had died trying to reach him, wondered how he would bear that guilt, if he would blame himself for not meeting her in Tombstone, for not being more specific about the distance and dangers involved. The trail curved around a rocky outcropping, and Clara followed it mechanically, one foot in front of the other, her entire world narrowed down to this simple repetitive motion. She didn't notice the change in vegetation at first, didn't register that the scrub brush was gradually giving way to hardier growth, didn't realize that the air smelled slightly different, carrying a hint of moisture. She rounded another bend and stopped abruptly, certain her eyes were deceiving her again, another cruel trick of her oxygen-starved brain. But the image didn't waver or disappear. There in the moonlight stood 3 cottonwood trees, their distinctive leaves silver in the pale light, and beyond them she could make out the dark shape of buildings, a house and barn, and several outbuildings arranged around a dusty yard. Clara's knees buckled, and she caught herself against a boulder, staring at the ranch that had existed only in her imagination for so many months, now suddenly real and solid before her. Lamplight glowed in the windows of the house, warm and welcoming, and she could hear the lowing of cattle in the distance, the creak of a windmill turning in the night breeze. She tried to call out, but her throat wouldn't produce sound, tried to walk faster, but her legs wouldn't obey, tried to feel relief, but all she felt was a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull her down into unconsciousness. She forced herself forward anyway, covering the last quarter-mile through sheer determination, her eyes fixed on that lamplight like a beacon guiding her home. The ranch yard was neatly maintained despite the hardscrabble surroundings, the fences well built, the barn doors closed against predators, everything speaking of a man who took pride in his work. Clara reached the porch steps and grabbed the railing for support, her legs shaking so badly she wasn't sure they'd carry her up those 3 steps. She hauled herself upward using the railing, each step a monumental effort, and finally reached the door. She raised her fist to knock, but the motion unbalanced her, and she fell against the door instead, her weight hitting the wood with a solid thump. For a moment, nothing happened, and Clara wondered if she'd come to the wrong ranch, if James even lived here, if this was all some terrible mistake. Then the door opened abruptly, and she fell forward into a man's arms, her body finally giving up now that she'd reached safety. She heard him curse in surprise, felt strong hands catching her, lowering her carefully to the porch floor. Clara forced her eyes to focus on the face above her, lamplight spilling from the doorway behind him. And even through her blurred vision she recognized James Thornton, his features older and more weathered than she remembered but unmistakably him, his blue eyes wide with shock and something that looked like disbelief. "Clara," his voice cracked on her name, and she watched his expression cycle through confusion to recognition to horror as he took in her condition. "Oh God, Clara, what happened? Where did you come from?" She tried to answer, but her throat wouldn't cooperate, could only make a small rasping sound that might have been his name. His hands moved over her, checking for injuries, and when he touched her face his fingers came away dusty and streaked with her dried tears. "Water," he said urgently, though whether to her or himself she couldn't tell. "Hold on, sweetheart, just hold on." He disappeared back into the house, and Clara lay on the porch floor, staring up at the star-filled sky, her vision darkening at the edges. She'd made it, she thought distantly. She'd walked 40 miles through desert and survived, had reached his ranch against all odds, and now she could finally rest. James returned and slid an arm under her shoulders, lifting her to a half-sitting position with her back against his chest. "Slow sips," he told her, his voice rough with emotion, and pressed a tin cup to her lips. The water was cool and sweet, and Clara wanted to gulp it down to drain the entire cup in seconds, but James controlled the flow, giving her only small amounts at a time. "Not too much at first," he murmured, and she realized his other arm was wrapped around her, holding her against him, and that his body was shaking. "You'll make yourself sick. Just slow sips, that's right." She managed 3 swallows before he pulled the cup away, and though she wanted to protest, wanted to beg for more, she found she couldn't make her voice work. James set the cup aside and shifted his grip on her, cradling her more securely, and Clara felt something wet hit her shoulder, then another drop, and another. She tilted her head back to look at him and saw tears streaming down his face, his expression twisted with anguish and relief mingled together. "I didn't know you were coming," he said, his voice breaking. "Your last letter said you'd let me know when you'd made travel arrangements, but I never received anything else. I thought you'd changed your mind, thought maybe you'd decided I wasn't worth leaving Missouri for. If I'd known you were coming, I would have met you, would have brought you here safely." "How did you even find this place?" Clara opened her mouth to answer but managed only a whisper that even she couldn't hear. James shook his head quickly, wiping at his eyes with one hand while keeping the other arm locked around her. "Don't try to talk yet. Just rest. Just let me take care of you." "God, Clara, when I think about what could have happened, what almost happened." He broke off, unable to continue, and buried his face in her hair, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She wanted to comfort him, wanted to tell him she was all right, wanted to explain about the letters that must have gone astray, about the journey that had brought her to his doorstep more dead than alive. But her body had other plans, and as she sat there wrapped in James's arms, the darkness at the edges of her vision expanded inward and pulled her down into unconsciousness. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and a cool cloth on her forehead. She blinked against the brightness, her eyes adjusting slowly, taking in details of a simply furnished bedroom with whitewashed walls and hand-hewn furniture. A quilt covered her, wedding ring pattern in blues and yellows, and beneath it she was dressed in a nightgown that wasn't hers, soft cotton that smelled of lavender. Her body ached in ways she hadn't known were possible, every muscle protesting as she tried to shift position, her throat still raw despite the water she'd drunk. "You're awake." James's voice came from beside the bed, and Clara turned her head to find him sitting in a wooden chair, elbows on his knees, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles shadowed his eyes and his jaw was covered in stubble, his hair standing up in places like he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. When their eyes met, his filled with fresh tears and he reached out to take her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "How do you feel?" "Terrible," Clara managed, her voice coming out as barely more than a rasp. "But alive." James laughed, the sound somewhere between relief and hysteria, and pressed her hand to his lips, his tears wetting her fingers. "You shouldn't be alive, you know that. The doctor said another few hours in that heat without water and you wouldn't have made it. 40 miles, Clara. You walked 40 miles through desert in July because you thought I was waiting for you." "You were waiting," Clara whispered, "just not where I expected." He stood abruptly and paced to the window, staring out at the bright morning, his back rigid with tension. "I should have been more clear in my letters. I should have given you better directions. I should have made sure you understood the distances involved out here, should have warned you more seriously about the dangers." He turned back to face her, his expression tormented. "I could have lost you before we even began, and it would have been entirely my fault." Clara tried to push herself up to sitting, but her arms wouldn't support her weight. James was at her side instantly, helping her up, arranging pillows behind her back, his movements careful and practiced. "How long have I been asleep?" she asked. 2 days, James replied, resuming his seat beside the bed. "The doctor said your body needed rest to recover from the ordeal. You've been in and out, drinking water when I woke you, but this is the first time you've really been conscious and coherent." He studied her face intently, as if memorizing every detail. "I changed your clothes. I hope you don't mind. It wasn't proper, but there's no other woman here to do it, and your dress was filthy and you needed to be comfortable." "Thank you," Clara said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks despite the circumstances. "For taking care of me, for giving me water, for not turning me away." "Turn you away?" James looked genuinely shocked. "Clara, you're my fiancée. You crossed half the country to be with me. You nearly died trying to reach me. Why on earth would I turn you away?" "Your letters stopped coming as frequently," Clara said softly. "The last few were shorter, less detailed. I wondered if you were having second thoughts, if you regretted asking me to come out here." James dragged his chair closer to the bed and took both her hands in his calloused thumbs rubbing circles on her palms. "The mail service out here is unreliable at best. Sometimes the stagecoach doesn't come for weeks. I wrote you every Sunday without fail, told you about building this house, about the cattle I'd purchased, about how much I was looking forward to your arrival. But I never received your letter saying when you'd be coming, never knew you were on your way." His grip tightened slightly. "If I'd known, Clara, I swear to you I would have been in Tombstone to meet you. I would never have let you attempt that journey alone. The station master in Tombstone told me your ranch was further north," Clara explained, her voice gradually growing stronger as she spoke. He offered to let me wait for a supply wagon, but I was so eager to see you, so tired of waiting and traveling and being apart. I thought I could make it in a day if I started early. I didn't realize how punishing the desert would be. You could have died, James said flatly, and she heard fear beneath the words, raw and unprocessed. When you collapsed on my porch when I saw the state you were in, I've never been so terrified in my life. I thought I was going to watch you die in my arms and there would be nothing I could do to stop it. Clara squeezed his hands, wanting to erase that fear from his eyes. But I didn't die. I made it here because I knew you were waiting. Because I wasn't going to let anything stop me from building a life with you. James leaned forward and pressed his forehead to their joined hands, his shoulders shaking with silent emotion. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed but clear. I don't deserve you, he said simply. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your faith in me. They sat in silence for a moment, the magnitude of what had happened and what had almost happened settling between them. Clara studied James's face in the morning light, seeing the changes that 8 months of hard ranch work had wrought. He was leaner than she remembered, his face more lined, his hands rougher, but his eyes were the same, that clear blue that had captivated her at her cousin's wedding. She'd fallen in love with his dreams that night in Kansas City, but looking at him now she realized she'd fallen in love with more than dreams. She'd fallen in love with the man who'd pursued those dreams, who'd built something real out here in this harsh country. Tell me about the ranch, Clara said, wanting to hear his voice, wanting to understand the life she'd risked everything to be part of. Your letters described it, but I want to hear it from you now. James's expression softened and he settled back in his chair, still holding her hands. 300 acres along a creek bed that usually runs dry by August, but we had good winter snows so it's still flowing. 60 head of cattle, good breeding stock I bought from a rancher in New Mexico who was retiring. The house you're in now, 3 rooms, which I know isn't much but I built it myself, every board and nail. A barn that'll hold a dozen horses and winter feed for the cattle. A chicken coop, though I'll admit I'm terrible at tending chickens and I've lost half the flock to coyotes. Clara smiled at that last admission, and James's expression brightened seeing it. I have 2 hired hands who come during roundup and branding time, Mexican brothers named Carlos and Miguel who work several ranches in the area. The nearest neighbor is 10 miles south, a family named Patterson, and the nearest town is Prescott, about 20 miles west. It's isolated out here, Clara, more isolated than I made it sound in my letters. Sometimes I don't see another soul for weeks at a time. That doesn't frighten me, Clara said, and realized she meant it. Isolation I can handle. It's the thought of being apart from you that I couldn't bear anymore. James lifted her hands to his lips again, kissing each knuckle gently. The landscape is beautiful if you can appreciate harsh beauty. Mountains in the distance, sunsets that paint the whole sky, stars so bright and numerous you feel like you could reach up and touch them. It's not Missouri with its green fields and reliable rain. But there's something about this country that gets into your blood, makes you fall in love with it despite or maybe because of its difficulty. I saw the sunset last night, Clara said quietly, or at least part of it before I was too exhausted to appreciate it. It was beautiful. You'll see many more, James promised, and I'll be right beside you for all of them, I swear it. He hesitated, then continued more carefully. The doctor said you should rest for at least another week before attempting any strenuous activity. He left instructions for your care, medicines to help with the dehydration and exposure. I've arranged for Mrs. Patterson to come stay for a few days, for propriety's sake, since we're not yet married. She should arrive this afternoon. Clara felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. When will we marry? I assumed as soon as I arrived we would find a minister or justice of the peace. The circuit preacher comes through Prescott once a month, James explained. He was just here last week, which means we have 3 more weeks to wait for his next visit. Or we could ride to Prescott and see if the justice of the peace would perform the ceremony, though I'll be honest, Clara, I'm not sure you'll be strong enough for that journey for at least a few weeks. 20 miles on horseback is grueling even when you're healthy. I'll wait, Clara decided. I've come this far, I can wait 3 more weeks, and it will give me time to recover properly, to adjust to this new place, to get to know you again after so long apart. Relief flooded James's features. I was worried you'd want to rush into things, worried you'd push yourself before you were ready. Mrs. Patterson can act as chaperone, can help you with anything you need. She's a good woman, mother of 4, been out here for 10 years, so she knows the country and its demands. A knock on the front door interrupted them, and James squeezed Clara's hands before standing. That's probably the doctor, come to check on you. He's been here twice a day since you arrived, refused to accept payment until he was satisfied you were going to recover fully. James left the bedroom, and Clara heard voices in the main room. Low conversation she couldn't quite make out. She looked around the bedroom properly now that she was more alert, noting the care that had gone into its construction. The way the windows were positioned to catch cross breezes, the small details like the shelf for a washbasin and mirror, the hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. James had built this room thinking of her, she realized, had created this space with the intention of sharing it with his wife. The doctor appeared in the doorway, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a professional manner. Miss Bennett, I'm Dr. Harrison. I'm pleased to see you looking so much better than when I first examined you. How are you feeling? Sore, Clara admitted. Tired, thirsty, but much improved from when I arrived, doctor. Harrison approached the bed and began his examination, checking her pulse, listening to her breathing, looking at her eyes and throat. Your body went through a tremendous ordeal, he explained as he worked. Severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, exposure to intense sun without proper protection. Your feet are badly blistered and your skin is sunburned in places despite your clothing. You're going to need several weeks of rest and careful recovery before you're back to full strength. But I will recover fully, Clara asked anxiously. With proper care, yes, Dr. Harrison assured her. You're young and apparently quite resilient, given that you survived 40 miles of desert crossing. Many wouldn't have. But you must promise me you'll follow my instructions, which means staying in bed for at least another 3 days, then limiting your activity for at least 2 weeks after that. No long walks, no strenuous chores, plenty of water and simple foods until your system is fully recovered. Clara nodded her understanding, and Dr. Harrison finished his examination, then prescribed a tonic to help restore her strength. He spent another few minutes talking with James in the main room, his voice carrying through the open door with instructions and warnings about watching for signs of complications. When he finally left, James returned to the bedroom carrying a tray with soup, bread, and water. Mrs. Patterson sent this over yesterday, he explained, setting the tray on Clara's lap. She's been cooking for us since you arrived, bringing meals twice a day. I'm afraid my own cooking skills leave much to be desired, another thing I failed to mention in my letters. Clara smiled and picked up the spoon, finding her hands steadier than they'd been earlier. The soup was rich with vegetables and beef, and she ate slowly, savoring each bite, her body crying out for nourishment. James watched her eat with an intensity that made her self-conscious, his eyes tracking every movement. I'm not going to disappear, Clara said gently. You can stop looking at me like I'm about to vanish. I keep thinking I'll wake up and discover this was all a fever dream, James admitted. That you didn't really come, that you're not really here. For months I hoped you'd arrive, and then when your letters stopped I thought you'd changed your mind, thought I'd lost you. And then you appeared on my doorstep like something out of a dream, more dead than alive, and I've been terrified every moment since that I'll lose you anyway, that surviving the desert doesn't mean you'll survive the recovery. Clara set down her spoon and reached for his hand. I'm here, James. I'm real, I'm alive, and I'm not going anywhere. We're going to have the life we planned, the life you wrote about in your letters. It just started a bit more dramatically than either of us expected. James laughed shakily and brought her hand to his cheek, holding it there. You're braver than any woman I've ever known. Braver than most men, for that matter. Walking 40 miles through desert alone takes a kind of courage I can barely comprehend. Or a kind of foolishness, Clara said wryly. Looking back, it wasn't my most intelligent decision. If I'd waited for the supply wagon like the station master suggested, none of this would have happened. But you didn't wait because you were eager to see me, James said, his voice full of wonder. Because you loved me enough to risk everything. I don't know what I did to deserve that kind of devotion, but I'm going to make sure you never regret it. Clara finished her soup while James told her about the past 8 months, filling in details his letters had glossed over. He spoke about the loneliness of frontier life, the way days could pass without hearing another human voice, the constant work required to keep a ranch running. He talked about the challenges of the drought, the difficulty of finding reliable water sources, the nights he'd lain awake worrying about whether his cattle would survive the summer. He described the beauty too, the unexpected moments of grace, a family of deer drinking from his creek at dawn, a sky full of migrating birds, the satisfaction of watching his herd grow healthy and strong. It's a hard life, he concluded honestly. Harder than I expected when I left Kansas City. Some days I wonder if I was crazy to attempt this, to think I could make a success of ranching in territory this unforgiving. But then I think about building something lasting, creating something with my own hands, and I can't imagine doing anything else. Then we'll do it together, Clara said firmly. That's why I'm here, James, not just to be your wife but to be your partner in building this life. I can learn to ranch, learn to survive in this country. I'm stronger than I look, present circumstances notwithstanding. I don't doubt your strength for a moment, James assured her. Anyone who can walk 40 miles through desert has strength beyond measure, but I need you to understand that ranch life for a woman is demanding in ways that genteel Missouri life never prepared you for. There won't be teas and social calls and dressmakers. There will be cooking over a wood stove in 100-degree heat, hauling water, tending chickens, maybe helping with cattle when my hands aren't available. It's backbreaking work, Clara, and it never ends. Do you think I came all this way expecting a life of leisure? Clara asked, hearing the edge in her voice. I knew what I was signing up for, James. Your letters were clear about the realities of frontier life. I chose this anyway because I chose you. Because building a life together matters more to me than comfort or society's approval or any of the things I left behind. James's expression softened, and he leaned forward to cup her face in his calloused palm. I just need to be certain you understand what you're committing to. Once we're married, once you're truly established here, going back east won't be a simple option. You'll be tied to this land and this life as surely as I am. Good, Clara said simply. I don't want simple options or escape routes. I want a life with you wherever that life takes us. James kissed her then, gentle and careful, mindful of her injured lips and weakened state. It was their first kiss since that night in Kansas City 8 months ago, and Clara felt the same spark she'd felt then, the same certainty that this man was meant to be hers, that their lives were supposed to intertwine despite the improbability of their meeting, the brevity of their courtship, the challenges they faced. When they separated, both were smiling, and some of the tension that had hung in the air since Clara's arrival dissipated. I should let you rest, James said reluctantly. Doctor's orders, but I'll be right outside if you need anything at all. Clara settled back against the pillows, suddenly exhausted despite having done nothing but lie in bed and eat soup. Her body was still recovering, still healing from the ordeal she'd put it through, and sleep pulled at her insistently. Stay, she murmured, her eyes already closing. Just until I fall asleep. I don't want to be alone. James resumed his seat beside the bed and took her hand again, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. I'll stay as long as you need, he promised, and his voice was the last thing Clara heard before sleep claimed her again. The next few days passed in a gentle rhythm of sleeping and waking, eating and talking, slowly recovering strength. Mrs. Patterson arrived that first afternoon, a stout, practical woman in her 40s who took charge of the household with cheerful efficiency. She cooked hearty meals, kept the house tidy, changed Clara's bandages, and provided the proper chaperonage that propriety demanded. She also proved to be a wealth of information about life in the territory, sharing stories about her own arrival 10 years earlier, the challenges she'd faced, the ways she'd adapted. The isolation was hardest at first, Mrs. Patterson confided one afternoon while helping Clara take her first tentative steps around the bedroom. I'd come from Philadelphia, where I'd grown up surrounded by people and activity. Out here, I'd go weeks without seeing another woman, months without attending church or any social gathering. I thought I'd go mad from loneliness. How did you manage? Clara asked, leaning heavily on the older woman's arm as she shuffled across the room. I learned to find satisfaction in small things, Mrs. Patterson explained. A successful garden, a well-cooked meal, watching my children thrive despite the hardships. And I learned that loneliness and solitude aren't the same thing. Solitude can be peaceful if you make friends with it, if you learn to appreciate your own company and the quiet beauty of this land. Clara absorbed this wisdom, understanding that Mrs. Patterson was preparing her for the reality of ranch life, gently helping her adjust expectations and build resilience. Over the course of several days, the two women developed a friendship that transcended their difference in age and experience, united by the shared experience of being Eastern women adapting to Western demands. James spent his days working the ranch but checked on Clara frequently, bringing her small gifts from his labors. A perfectly smooth stone from the creek bed, a feather from a hawk, wildflowers that somehow survived the brutal heat. They talked for hours, getting to know each other properly, learning each other's histories and habits and dreams. Clara told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father's mercantile business, about the brother who died in childhood and the sister who'd married respectably and lived 3 streets away from their parents. James spoke about his own childhood in Ohio, about losing his parents to influenza when he was 16, about working his way west through a series of ranch jobs, saving every penny until he could afford to claim his own land. Why Arizona Territory? Clara asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Clara wrapped in a quilt despite the heat, James in the chair beside her. You could have ranched anywhere. Why choose somewhere so harsh? James considered the question, his eyes on the distant mountains turned purple in the fading light. Because it was available, for one thing. Land here is cheap compared to Texas or Colorado because fewer people want it. But also because I was drawn to the challenge of it, I suppose. I wanted to prove I could make something succeed in difficult conditions, wanted to test myself against country that doesn't forgive mistakes. And have you proven it? Clara asked quietly. I'm surviving, James said. Some years that's all you can hope for in country like this. But slowly, year by year, I'm building something sustainable. Another few years and I'll have a herd large enough to be profitable, assuming the drought breaks and the cattle survive. Another few years after that and maybe I can hire permanent hands, expand the operation. It's slow going, but it's progress. Clara reached across the space between their chairs and found his hand, lacing their fingers together. It's our progress now, she reminded him. Our ranch, our herd, our future. You're not alone anymore, James. He turned to look at her, his expression full of an emotion Clara couldn't quite name, something deeper than simple affection, more complex than gratitude. I never expected to feel this way, he said slowly. When I proposed to you in Kansas City, I cared for you, was attracted to you, thought we'd suit each other well. But these past days, taking care of you, talking with you, learning who you really are beyond those brief 2 weeks, I've fallen in love with you properly, completely. You're not just the pretty girl I danced with at a wedding anymore. You're the woman who walked 40 miles to reach me, who survived what shouldn't have been survivable, who looks at this harsh country and sees possibility instead of hardship. Tears pricked Clara's eyes and she blinked them back. "I fell in love with you through your letters," she confessed. "Every Sunday when a new one arrived, I'd read it over and over, picturing the life you described, imagining myself beside you living it. The man who wrote those letters was thoughtful and honest and unafraid of hard work. He had dreams, but also the determination to achieve them. That's who I fell in love with, and meeting you again, seeing what you've built here, I love you even more than I did when I boarded that stagecoach in Missouri." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, the same stars Clara had watched the night she'd stumbled onto his property, though they seemed gentler now, less cold and distant. The night air cooled rapidly, and James eventually insisted she go back inside, concerned about her catching a chill, still protective of her recovering health. By the end of the week, Clara was able to walk around the house without assistance, and by the end of the second week she was helping Mrs. Patterson with light chores despite both James and the doctor's protests. She needed to feel useful, needed to start learning the skills she'd require as a ranch wife, and Mrs. Patterson proved an excellent teacher, patient and thorough in her instruction. Clara learned to cook on the wood stove, adjusting recipes for the high altitude and dry climate. She learned to make bread that didn't turn out dense and heavy, to fry meat without burning it, to stretch supplies to make them last between trips to town. She learned to tend the chickens, gathering eggs and feeding them, though she agreed with James that the birds were far more trouble than they seemed worth. She learned to spot clean laundry between major washing days, to conserve water, to mend clothes so the repairs were nearly invisible. "You're a quick study," Mrs. Patterson observed approvingly. "Some Eastern women never adjust, spend years complaining about every hardship instead of learning to work within the constraints. But you've got practical sense, which matters more out here than fancy education or refined manners." The circuit preacher's expected arrival approached, and the household prepared for the wedding. Mrs. Patterson offered to make Clara a dress, but Clara insisted on wearing the one good dress she'd brought from Missouri, a simple design in pale blue that she'd packed in her abandoned carpet bag. James rode out to search for it, and miraculously found it where Clara had left it beside the trail, dusty and sun-faded but intact, the strapwork eaten through by some animal but the contents mostly undamaged. Clara washed the dress carefully, pressed it with the heavy iron heated on the stove, and hung it ready for the wedding day. She had no veil, no flowers, no trousseau full of fine linens and delicate nightgowns. She had only herself, recovered from her desert ordeal, stronger now and more certain of her choice than she'd been even when boarding the stagecoach in Missouri. The day before the preacher was due to arrive, James took Clara on a tour of the ranch property, moving slowly to accommodate her still healing feet, pointing out boundaries and landmarks. He showed her the creek bed where water still trickled despite the late summer heat, the pasture where his cattle grazed, the far corner of the property where he planned to build a larger barn once finances allowed. "It's not much now," he said as they stood on a small rise overlooking the ranch, the house and outbuildings looking tiny against the vast landscape. "But in 10 years, 20 years, this could be something substantial. A real cattle operation, maybe a dozen hands, breeding stock that other ranchers seek out. I have plans, Clara, big plans for this place." "Tell me," Clara encouraged, wanting to understand his vision, wanting to make it her own. James painted pictures with words, describing the ranch he saw in his mind's eye. A bigger house with multiple bedrooms for the children he hoped they'd have, a proper barn with stalls for breeding horses, expanded pastures supporting hundreds of cattle instead of dozens. He talked about possibly adding sheep, though he acknowledged that might make him unpopular with other cattlemen. He mentioned the possibility of irrigating fields to grow hay and grain, becoming more self-sufficient instead of dependent on supplies from town. "It sounds wonderful," Clara said when he'd finished and meant it. She could see what he saw, could imagine the years of work transforming this rough beginning into something prosperous and lasting. "We'll build it together, slowly but surely. Our children will inherit something worthwhile," James said, then flushed slightly. "If we have children, I'm assuming, but perhaps that's not something you want." Clara laughed and squeezed his arm. "I want children, James, several of them, God willing. I want this house filled with noise and chaos and love. I want to raise sons and daughters who understand the value of hard work and appreciate the beauty of this harsh country." Relief flooded James's features. "I want that too," he admitted. "Want to teach my sons to ranch, want to watch my daughters grow strong and capable. Want to build something that lasts beyond our own lives." They walked back to the house hand in hand, talking about the future with the easy intimacy of a couple long married rather than one about to wed. Clara felt a sense of rightness settling into her bones, a certainty that every choice that had brought her to this moment had been correct, despite the dangers and difficulties. She belonged here, belonged with this man, belonged to this country that had nearly killed her, but instead had made her stronger. That evening, Mrs. Patterson prepared a special meal to celebrate the upcoming wedding, and after dinner, the three of them sat on the porch in the cooling darkness. Mrs. Patterson told stories about her own wedding day, about the early years of her marriage, about the compromises and adjustments required when two people from different backgrounds try to build a life together. "Marriage in frontier country is different from marriage back east," she explained. "You'll depend on each other in ways city folks never experience. When James is sick or injured, you'll have to manage the ranch alone. When you're dealing with childbirth or illness, he'll have to care for the household. There's no division of labor that can't be crossed when necessity demands it." "I understand," Clara said, and she did, more deeply now than she would have before her desert walk. She'd learned something about her own capabilities during those 40 miles, had discovered reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known she possessed. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with that same stubborn refusal to give up. The circuit preacher arrived the next morning, a Methodist minister named Reverend Daniels, who traveled between settlements conducting services and performing ceremonies. He was older than Clara expected, with white hair and a weathered face, but his handshake was firm and his eyes were kind. Mrs. Patterson had invited her own family to serve as witnesses, and they arrived mid-morning. Mr. Patterson, a quiet man with capable hands and 4 children ranging from 6 to 14, all excited by the novelty of a wedding. The ceremony took place in the main room of James's house, with everyone crowded into the small space, the furniture pushed against the walls to create an open area. Clara wore her blue dress and carried a bouquet of wildflowers James had picked that morning, their colors bright against the pale fabric. James wore his best shirt and pants, his hair still damp from washing, his face cleanly shaved. And when Clara entered the room, his expression transformed into something so tender and full of love that she felt tears threaten. Reverend Daniels conducted a simple ceremony, his words about commitment and partnership and building a godly life together. He spoke about the unique challenges of frontier marriage, about relying on faith and each other through hardships, about finding joy in small blessings. When he asked if James would take Clara as his lawfully wedded wife, James's "I will" was firm and sure, his eyes never leaving hers. When he asked the same of Clara, she answered with equal certainty, meaning every word of the vows she spoke. They exchanged rings, simple gold bands James had purchased months ago in Prescott in anticipation of this day. And when Reverend Daniels pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with a tenderness that made Clara's heart ache with happiness. The small gathering applauded and the Patterson children cheered, and Clara felt the last piece of her old life fall away, replaced entirely by this new identity as James Thornton's wife, as a woman of Arizona territory, as someone who belonged to this harsh, beautiful country. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a wedding feast, simple but generous. And they all ate together while the children ran between the house and yard burning off energy. Reverend Daniels shared news from other settlements, spoke about families Clara would eventually meet, described the slow but steady growth of civilization in the territory. Mr. Patterson and James discussed cattle prices and water rights and other ranching concerns while Clara and Mrs. Patterson cleaned up the meal and talked about plans for Clara's first garden come spring. By late afternoon, the guests departed, heading back to their own ranches before darkness fell. And suddenly, Clara and James were alone together for the first time as husband and wife. An awkwardness descended that hadn't existed before, both of them hyper-aware that this was their wedding night, that expectations and intimacies they'd avoided during the chaperoned weeks now loomed before them. "Are you nervous?" James asked quietly, standing by the window watching the sun set. "A little," Clara admitted honestly. "Are you?" James turned to face her, his expression serious but gentle. "I've been alone for a long time," he said carefully. "I've forgotten how to share space with another person, how to consider someone else's needs and preferences. I'm worried I'll disappoint you, that the reality of being married to me won't match whatever you imagined." Clara crossed the room to stand before him, taking his hands in hers. "I didn't walk 40 miles through desert for an imagination or a fantasy. I came here for you, for the real man, flaws and all. Whatever adjustments we need to make, whatever compromises are necessary, we'll figure them out together." James pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and Clara rested her head against his chest, hearing his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "I promise I'll spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice in coming here, in marrying me." "I already know I did," Clara said simply, and tilted her face up to kiss him. Their wedding night was tender and awkward and sweet. Two people learning each other's bodies and responses, navigating intimacy with more care than passion, both aware of Clara's still healing injuries and the strangeness of this new closeness. But beneath the awkwardness was genuine affection, and by the time they fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, Clara felt a bone-deep contentment she'd never experienced before. The weeks that followed established the rhythm of their married life. James worked the ranch from dawn until dusk, and Clara managed the household, learning through trial and error how to be a frontier wife. She made mistakes, burned meals and ruined clothes in the wash, and accidentally left the chicken coop open so half the remaining birds escaped. But she learned from each error, became more competent, more confident in her abilities. James proved to be a patient teacher and a considerate husband, never criticizing her mistakes, always offering encouragement and assistance. They worked side by side when ranch duties required extra hands, Clara learning to help with cattle, to mend fences, to handle horses. Her body grew stronger, her hands more calloused, her skin browner from sun exposure despite her best efforts to protect it. The isolation misses Patterson had warned about became Clara's daily reality. Days passed without seeing another soul, without hearing any voice but James's and her own. At first the silence felt oppressive, the emptiness of the landscape overwhelming. But gradually, Clara learned to appreciate the solitude, to find peace in the quiet rhythms of ranch life, to hear beauty in sounds she'd once ignored. Wind through the cottonwood trees, cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of the windmill turning. She started keeping a journal, writing letters to her family even though she had no way to send them until James's next trip to Prescott. She described her new life in careful detail, wanting them to understand she'd made the right choice even if they couldn't comprehend it. She wrote about the desert that had nearly killed her but now seemed less hostile, more like home. She wrote about James, about the man he was when not constrained by the formality of courtship, about the way he sang off-key while working, about his terrible jokes and his surprising tenderness. September arrived and the heat broke slightly, the nights cooling enough to make sleep comfortable. James taught Clara to shoot, spending evenings practicing with tin cans lined up on fence posts, insisting she needed to be able to defend herself and the ranch when he was away. Clara proved a decent shot with the rifle, though she hated the noise and the kick against her shoulder. Still, she understood the necessity and practiced until James was satisfied she could hit what she aimed at. October brought their first real challenge as a married couple when James needed to drive a portion of his cattle to market in Prescott, a journey that would take him away for nearly a week. Clara insisted she could manage alone, that she'd be fine, but James worried visibly about leaving her. "The Pattersons will check on you," he said the morning of his departure, already having postponed leaving twice. "I've told them you're alone and they promise to send one of their boys over daily. Keep the rifle loaded and the doors locked at night. Don't attempt anything dangerous with the cattle, just make sure they have access to the creek and leave everything else for when I return." "I'll be fine," Clara assured him, though she felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of being completely alone for the first time since her arrival. "You need to get those cattle to market before prices drop further. We need the income, James. Go, do what needs to be done, and come home safely." He kissed her goodbye with an intensity that spoke of his reluctance to leave, and Clara stood in the yard watching until he and the cattle disappeared over the ridge heading west. Then she turned back to the house, suddenly very aware of its emptiness, of the miles of uninhabited country surrounding her, of how truly alone she was. The first day passed uneventfully. Clara threw herself into chores, keeping busy to avoid dwelling on her isolation. She baked bread, cleaned the house thoroughly, mended clothes, tended the chickens, hauled water from the creek. The Pattersons' eldest son, a gangly 14-year-old named Thomas, arrived in the afternoon to check on her and stayed long enough to chop wood for the stove, filling the bin to overflowing before riding home again. The second day was harder. Without James's presence, the house seemed too quiet, almost threatening in its silence. Clara found herself starting at shadows, hearing menace in ordinary sounds, the wind becoming whispers, the cattle's movements becoming potential intruders. She forced herself to remain calm, to be rational, but by nightfall she was exhausted from the constant vigilance. The third day brought real trouble. Clara woke to find several cattle had broken through a weak section of fence during the night and wandered into the rougher country beyond the ranch boundaries. She spent hours searching for them on foot, finally locating them in a rocky ravine 2 miles from the house. Getting them back proved nearly impossible alone, the animals stubborn and uncooperative, and by the time she finally managed to drive them toward home, the sun was setting and Clara was filthy, exhausted, and fighting back tears of frustration. She repaired the fence as best she could in the fading light, knowing James would have done it better but satisfied she'd at least prevented further escapes. Thomas arrived while she was finishing and helped her complete the job, then insisted on staying until she was safely inside with the door locked. Clara appreciated his concern, but also felt a flash of resentment at being treated like a helpless female when she just spent hours successfully retrieving cattle and mending fence. The fourth day brought the sound of riders approaching and Clara grabbed the rifle, positioning herself at the window where she could see but not be easily seen. 3 men rode into the yard, Mexican from their appearance, and Clara's heart hammered with fear until she recognized Carlos and Miguel, James's hired hands, accompanied by a third man she didn't know. She opened the door cautiously, rifle still in hand, and Carlos swept off his hat with a respectful nod. "Senora Thornton, forgive the intrusion. We heard Senor James was in Prescott and wanted to check that you were managing well in his absence. This is my cousin Pedro, visiting from New Mexico." Relief flooded Clara and she lowered the rifle, inviting them to water their horses at the trough. The 3 men moved with the easy competence of people who'd spent their lives working cattle and horses, and Clara watched them enviously, wishing she possessed their casual skill. Before leaving, Carlos inspected her fence repair and made several improvements, while Miguel checked the cattle and confirmed they all seemed healthy. "You did well, Señora," Carlos told her before they departed. "Many women would have panicked or given up when the cattle escaped. Señor James chose wisely when he chose you for his wife." The compliment warmed Clara more than the man could have known, validation that she was succeeding in this hard new life despite her frequent doubts and frustrations. She waved as they rode away, then returned to the house feeling more confident, more capable than she had in days. James returned on the 6th day, riding into the yard just after dawn looking trail-worn but satisfied. Clara ran out to meet him, unconcerned with propriety or dignity, throwing herself into his arms the moment he dismounted. He caught her with a laugh, holding her tight, burying his face in her hair. "I missed you," he said simply. "Every mile I was gone, I missed you. How did you manage?" Clara told him about the escaped cattle, the fence repair, Carlos and Miguel's visit, and James listened with pride evident in his expression. "You handled everything exactly right," he praised. "I knew you would, but I still worried. Coming home to find you safe and the ranch in order is the best welcome I could have hoped for." "How was Prescott?" Clara asked as they walked to the house, James's arm around her shoulders. "Did you get good prices?" "Better than expected," James replied. "Enough to see us through winter comfortably and buy some supplies we've been needing. I brought you something, too." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a package wrapped in brown paper, which he handed to Clara with shy pleasure. Inside was fabric, 3 yards of sturdy cotton in a cheerful yellow print, perfect for making a new dress. Clara traced the pattern with her fingers, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful, James, thank you." "I know it's not fancy," he said uncertainly. "But I noticed your dresses are wearing thin, and I thought you might like something new." Clara kissed him thoroughly, unconcerned that they were standing in the open yard where anyone might see. "It's perfect," she assured him. "I'll make a dress that I can wear for years, and every time I put it on I'll remember how you thought of me while you were away." They spent the rest of the day together, James resting from his journey while Clara caught him up on all the small details of the days he'd been gone. That night, reunited in their bed, their lovemaking was less tentative than it had been, more assured, both of them more comfortable with physical intimacy, more confident in their ability to please each other. Winter arrived gradually, the days shortening, the nights growing cold. James prepared the ranch for the seasonal changes, moving cattle closer to the house, stockpiling hay and feed, reinforcing buildings against potential snow. Clara preserved what vegetables she could obtain from the Pattersons, learning to can and pickle and store food against the lean months ahead. She sewed her new dress and made James 2 new shirts from fabric he'd also brought from Prescott, her stitching growing neater with practice. December brought their first real storm, snow falling steadily for 2 days, transforming the harsh brown landscape into something magical and otherworldly. Clara had never seen snow like this, Missouri storms being typically brief and light. This was different, inches accumulating rapidly, drifting against the buildings, making even the short walk to the barn an adventure. James worked constantly during the storm, checking cattle, breaking ice on water troughs, ensuring the animals had adequate shelter and feed. Clara helped where she could, learning to bundle against cold as intense as the summer heat had been. When the storm finally cleared, the world was white and silent and breathtakingly beautiful. Clara stood on the porch wrapped in James's coat, staring at the transformed landscape, and felt something shift inside her. This was home now, completely and irrevocably. Not Missouri with its green fields and familiar comforts, but Arizona territory with its extremes and challenges and harsh beauty. She'd become someone new here, someone stronger and more capable than the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach in Tombstone. Christmas approached, and Clara felt homesick for the first time since her arrival, missing her family's traditions, the church services and carol singing and elaborate meals. James noticed her melancholy and did his best to create their own celebration, cutting a small juniper tree and helping her decorate it with strings of popcorn and paper ornaments. They couldn't attend church services, the distance to Prescott being too great in winter conditions, but they read scripture together on Christmas morning and exchanged simple gifts. James gave Clara a hand-carved box he'd made during evenings when she thought he was just whittling to pass time. It was beautiful, the wood smooth and fitted perfectly, the lid decorated with a carved design of cottonwood leaves. Clara gave James a new leather belt she'd crafted using scraps and tools borrowed from Mr. Patterson, her first attempt at leatherwork clumsy but functional. They cooked a special meal together, roasting one of their precious chickens, and spent the day talking and reading and simply enjoying each other's company. "This is different from how I imagined spending Christmas," Clara admitted as they sat by the fire that evening, "but I wouldn't change it. Being here with you matters more than any elaborate celebration." James pulled her close, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "Next year we'll be more prepared," he promised. "We'll plan ahead, make it more special. Maybe invite the Pattersons over, create some new traditions." "I'd like that," Clara said. "But honestly, James, as long as we're together, I'm happy." "That probably sounds naive or overly romantic, but it's true. You're my home now more than any place or house or even country. Wherever you are is where I belong." James's arm tightened around her and Clara felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire, warm and safe while outside the wind howled and the temperature dropped below freezing. Clara thought about the woman she'd been when she'd stepped off that stagecoach, so certain and so naive, having no real understanding of what lay ahead. She thought about the 40 miles she'd walked through desert, the moment James had opened his door to find her collapsed on his porch, the tears on his face as he'd given her water and held her like something precious nearly lost. That moment seemed like a lifetime ago now, yet also like yesterday. It had been the beginning of everything, the foundation their marriage was built upon, proof that they could survive anything as long as they faced it together. Clara had nearly died reaching James's ranch, but in a way she'd been reborn here, transformed from an Eastern girl playing at frontier life into a woman who genuinely belonged to this hard country. Winter deepened and January brought more storms, the ranch becoming an island of civilization in a sea of white. James and Clara developed a rhythm to their days, dividing tasks efficiently, working together with practiced ease. On days when weather prevented outside work, they stayed indoors reading, talking, playing cards, making love in the middle of the afternoon simply because they could. Clara discovered she was pregnant in late January, confirmed her suspicions with Mrs. Patterson's help during a brief break in the weather that allowed visiting. She told James that evening over dinner, watching nervousness and joy war across his features. "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "I know we talked about wanting children, but perhaps you wanted to wait longer to be more established first." James left his chair and knelt beside hers, taking her hands in his. "I'm thrilled," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Scared, because bringing a child into this world is always frightening, but thrilled. You're going to be a wonderful mother, Clara, and we'll figure out the rest together, like we figure out everything else." Relief flooded Clara and she cupped his face in her hands, kissing him gently. "We'll need to prepare," she said practically. "The baby will come in late summer or early fall. We'll need supplies, proper clothes and blankets, and I'll need Mrs. Patterson's help or the doctor's during the birth." "We'll arrange everything," James promised. "Whatever you need, whatever will make you feel safe and prepared, we'll make it happen." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through winter and into spring. Clara suffered morning sickness that lasted well into afternoon, but otherwise felt healthy and strong. Her body changed, her belly swelling with their growing child, and James treated her with such careful tenderness that Clara sometimes had to remind him she wasn't made of glass. They prepared a corner of the bedroom as a nursery, James building a cradle from wood he'd been saving, Clara sewing tiny gowns and blankets from fabric Mrs. Patterson helped her obtain. Spring brought new life to the ranch, calves being born, the creek running full from snowmelt, green appearing in previously brown landscape. Clara planted her first garden with Mrs. Patterson's guidance, learning which vegetables might survive the climate, how to protect tender plants from late frosts and early heat. She worked more slowly now, her growing belly making some tasks difficult. But she refused to become an invalid, insisting on maintaining her share of household responsibilities. James began hiring Carlos and Miguel for longer periods, bringing them on for the spring roundup and branding, acknowledging he'd need more help with Clara pregnant, and unable to assist as she had previously. The two men were unfailingly respectful and helpful, treating Clara with the same careful courtesy they showed James, and she enjoyed having their presence break the isolation, even if they spoke mostly Spanish between themselves. May brought a scare when Clara developed severe pains that had her convinced she was miscarrying. James rode for the doctor in a panic, leaving Carlos to stay with Clara, and the hours until medical help arrived were the longest of her life. Dr. Harrison examined her thoroughly and finally pronounced that while she needed to rest more and stop pushing herself so hard, the baby seemed fine, and the pains were likely from overexertion rather than anything more serious. "You're not superhuman, Mrs. Thornton," the doctor told her sternly. "I know frontier life demands much of women, but you need to consider your child's well-being and your own. Rest means actual rest, not simply doing lighter chores. Your husband can manage the ranch for a few months without your assistance." Clara promised to be more careful and actually kept that promise, forcing herself to rest even when it felt like laziness, accepting help even when it wounded her pride. James hired a young Mexican girl named Rosa to come help with household tasks, giving Clara even less excuse to overwork herself. Rosa was 15, shy and sweet, and Clara enjoyed teaching her better English while Rosa taught her more Spanish. They worked side by side preparing meals and cleaning house, and Clara appreciated having another woman's company, someone to talk with during the long days when James was working the range. Summer arrived with its familiar brutal heat, made worse by Clara's pregnancy. She spent the hottest part of each day resting in the coolest part of the house, too uncomfortable to do much beyond reading or sewing. James worried constantly, his concern sometimes smothering, but Clara understood it came from love and tried to be patient with his hovering. He brought her cool water from the spring, fanned her when she couldn't sleep, rubbed her swollen feet and ankles each evening. "I look like a cow," Clara complained one evening in late July, studying her profile in the small mirror. "I can't even see my feet anymore." "You look beautiful," James insisted, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on her swollen belly. "You're carrying our child, creating life. There's nothing more beautiful than that." Clara leaned back against him, feeling the baby kick against James's palms. "He's active tonight," she observed, "or she, I suppose, will know soon enough." "Do you have a preference?" James asked. "Boy or girl?" "Healthy," Clara said simply. "That's all I care about, healthy baby surviving the birth, both of us coming through it safely, the rest is details." But privately, she hoped for a son, someone to learn ranching from James, to eventually take over this enterprise they were building. She pictured a boy with James's blue eyes and her dark hair, growing up understanding this land, belonging to it in a way she and James never fully would. Then she imagined a daughter, strong and capable, learning to shoot and ride and ranch alongside any man. Either way, their child would be raised to appreciate the harsh beauty of Arizona territory, to understand the value of hard work and persistence. August brought the baby, arriving 2 weeks earlier than expected on a morning when James was checking cattle in the far pasture. Clara's labor started suddenly, intense from the beginning, and Rosa ran to find James while Mrs. Patterson, who'd been staying at the ranch for the past week in anticipation, took charge. Clara labored through the midday heat, the pain coming in waves that left her gasping and crying out despite her determination to be stoic. James burst through the door in the middle of a contraction, wild-eyed and terrified, and Mrs. Patterson immediately put him to work boiling water and gathering supplies, giving him tasks to keep him occupied and out of the way. Clara heard his voice in the main room, speaking urgently, and knew he was praying, pleading with God to keep her safe, to let both her and the baby survive. The knowledge that he loved her that deeply gave her strength helped her push through the pain and exhaustion. The baby arrived as the sun was setting, born with a lusty cry that filled the house with sound. "A boy," Mrs. Patterson announced, placing the squalling infant on Clara's chest. "Healthy and strong, just like his mother." Clara looked down at her son, his face red and wrinkled, his tiny fists waving, and felt a love so powerful it hurt. This was her child, hers and James's, the physical manifestation of their love and commitment. She counted his fingers and toes, checked that everything was as it should be, then looked up to find James standing in the doorway with tears streaming down his face. "Come meet your son," Clara said softly, and James crossed the room on unsteady legs, kneeling beside the bed to stare at his child with wonder. "He's perfect," James whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's hand. Their son gripped that finger instinctively and James sobbed, overcome with emotion, his free hand finding Clara's and holding tight. "You're both perfect. Thank you, Clara. Thank you for surviving, for giving me this, for being braver and stronger than any woman I've ever known." They named him Samuel, after James's father, with the middle name William after Clara's grandfather. Samuel James William Thornton, a name too big for the tiny infant but one he'd grow into. Clara recovered from the birth more quickly than expected, her body already tough from 2 years of frontier life. And within days she was moving around the house, though Mrs. Patterson and James both insisted she take it easy. Samuel proved to be a good baby, crying primarily when hungry or uncomfortable, sleeping in longer stretches than Clara had dared hope. James was besotted, spending every free moment holding his son, talking to him, showing him around the ranch as if the infant could understand or appreciate it. Clara watched them together and felt her heart swell, seeing the man she loved transformed into a devoted father. Fall arrived and the ranch work intensified, preparing for winter, moving cattle, stockpiling supplies. Clara strapped Samuel to her chest in a sling Mrs. Patterson had made, keeping him close while she worked, adapting to the rhythms of motherhood alongside ranch life. It was exhausting, managing an infant while maintaining household responsibilities, but Clara discovered reserves of energy she hadn't known existed. The same determination that had carried her 40 miles through desert, now carrying her through sleepless nights and endless days. The first anniversary of their wedding approached, and James insisted on celebrating properly. He arranged for Rosa to watch Samuel for an evening, then took Clara on a sunset ride to a spot on the ranch she'd never visited, a high point where you could see for miles in every direction. They spread a blanket and shared a simple meal James had prepared, watching the sky turn gold and orange and purple. "A year ago today we got married," James said, his arm around Clara as they watched the stars emerge. "Best decision I ever made, asking you to marry me. Best day of my life when you said yes. Even better than the day Samuel was born," Clara teased gently. "Different kind of best," James clarified. "That day I became a father, which is incredible and overwhelming and terrifying. But the day we married, I gained a partner, someone to build a life with, someone who sees me and chooses me anyway. Both days were transformative, but in different ways." Clara turned to kiss him, soft and lingering. "I'd do it all again," she said when they separated. Every difficult moment, every challenge, even walking 40 miles through desert. It was all worth it to get here, to have this life with you. "You walked 40 miles, James mused, his tone almost reverent. I still can't comprehend the sheer will and determination it took. When I replay that night in my mind, opening the door to find you collapsed on my porch, I see how close I came to losing you before we'd even begun. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and reach for you, needing to confirm you're here, that I didn't lose you. I'm here, Clara assured him. And I'm not going anywhere. This is my home, James. This ranch, this country, this life we're building. I belong here as surely as you do. They stayed on the ridge until the night grew cold, reluctant to return to the responsibilities waiting at the house, savoring this rare moment of solitude and intimacy. When they finally rode back, Samuel was sleeping peacefully in Rosa's arms, and they paid the girl and sent her home before carrying their son to bed with them, the three of them tangled together in the darkness. The second year of their marriage passed in a blur of work and growth and gradual prosperity. The drought finally broke with good winter rains, the creek ran fuller than it had in years, and the grass came back thick and green. James's herd expanded as calves survived and thrived, and he was able to sell more cattle at better prices. They saved every penny they could, planning for expansion, for improvements, for the future they were methodically building. Samuel grew from infant to toddler, walking early and talking late, more interested in following his father around the ranch than sitting quietly with books or toys. Clara taught him his letters and numbers, but his real education was happening outdoors, learning about cattle and horses and the rhythms of ranch life. He was fearless in the way of small children, requiring constant supervision, and Clara sometimes had Rosa or one of the ranch hands watch him so she could complete tasks that were dangerous or impossible with a toddler underfoot. Clara discovered she was pregnant again when Samuel was 18 months old, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect, her mind not plagued with first-time anxieties. She continued working through most of the pregnancy, only slowing down in the final weeks, and when labor came, it was faster and easier than Samuel's birth had been. Their daughter arrived on a cool spring morning, born quickly and without complication. She was smaller than Samuel had been, more delicate with James's blue eyes and a surprisingly full head of dark hair. They named her Margaret Rose, called her Maggie from the first day, and she proved to be a different baby than her brother had been, more vocal and demanding, less easily soothed. Samuel adapted to having a sister with the resilience of young children, initially curious, then quickly bored, returning his attention to more interesting pursuits like helping his father feed the horses. James divided his time between work and family, somehow managing to be present for the important moments while still keeping the ranch running smoothly. He hired additional help, bringing Carlos and Miguel on permanently, building them a small bunkhouse near the barn. The ranch prospered gradually but steadily. James added to the herd each year, improved the outbuildings, expanded the fencing. Clara's garden grew more productive as she learned which plants thrived in the climate, and she began selling surplus vegetables to other ranches and in Prescott. They were building something real, something lasting, exactly what James had envisioned when he'd first claimed this land. Clara's family back in Missouri slowly accepted her choice, her letters eventually convincing them she was happy and thriving rather than suffering in frontier squalor. Her mother wrote regularly, sharing news from home, asking detailed questions about her grandchildren, and Clara reciprocated with equally detailed responses. The letters were the only connection to her old life, but Clara found she didn't miss Missouri the way she once thought she would. Arizona territory had gotten into her blood, made her part of itself, and she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. When Samuel was 4 and Maggie 2, James took them all on their first family trip to Prescott. It was an adventure, camping along the trail, showing the children a town after years of seeing only the ranch. Prescott was growing, becoming more civilized with proper stores and a church and even a small school. Clara enjoyed seeing other women, having conversations beyond household topics, feeling connected to something larger than their isolated ranch. But she was also relieved to return home, to the quiet and space and familiar rhythms of their life. The ranch wasn't isolated anymore, not to her. It was the center of her world, the place where everything important happened. She'd arrived here half dead from Desert Crossing, been saved by the man who'd become her husband, and had built a life beyond anything she'd imagined possible. Years continued passing, marked by seasons and cattle sales and children's birthdays. Samuel grew tall and lean like his father, competent with horses and cattle by age 8, already talking about taking over the ranch someday. Maggie was smaller and fiercer, refusing to be left behind, insisting on doing everything her brother did despite being 2 years younger. Clara taught them both to read and write and cipher, gave them the education she could provide, supplemented by occasional visits from a traveling teacher who made circuits through the territory. James and Clara's relationship deepened with time, the passion of early marriage evolving into something steadier and more profound. They knew each other completely now, the good and difficult parts, had weathered enough challenges together to trust their partnership absolutely. They could communicate with glances across a room, anticipate each other's needs, work in tandem without discussing plans. It was the kind of marriage Clara had always hoped for but never quite believed possible, built on friendship and respect and love that had been tested and proven durable. When Samuel turned 10, they added another room to the house, expanding to give the growing children more space. James and Carlos did most of the construction work, with Clara helping when she could, the whole family involved in the project. The expansion felt symbolic somehow, physical proof of how far they'd come from that first year when Clara had nearly died reaching this place, when James had been struggling alone to make the ranch viable. Clara sometimes thought about that 40-mile walk through desert, the moment that had nearly ended her life but instead had given her everything she now possessed. She'd been so young then, so naive about what frontier life actually entailed. If she could go back and talk to that younger self, stumbling through heat and exhaustion toward a ranch she'd never seen, what would she say? Would she warn herself about the difficulties ahead, try to prepare her for the challenges of isolation and hard work and a landscape that could kill without mercy? No, Clara decided. She wouldn't change anything, wouldn't warn or prepare or try to make it easier. That younger self had needed to discover her own strength, to learn through experience what she was capable of enduring and accomplishing. The woman she'd become had been forged in those 40 miles, in the moment James opened his door to find her collapsed, in the tears he'd shed while giving her water, in the days and weeks and years that had followed. On a late summer evening when Samuel was 12 and Maggie 10, the family sat on the porch watching the sunset, a routine they'd maintained for years. Samuel and Maggie argued amiably about nothing important, their voices rising and falling in familiar patterns. James had his arm around Clara, her head on his shoulder, both of them content to let the children's chatter wash over them. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. Leaving Missouri, walking through desert, choosing this hard life instead of something easier? Clara didn't even have to think about her answer. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. This life, this family, this place, it's everything I never knew I wanted." "Every hardship was worth it, James. Every difficult day led to this, to right now, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." James kissed the top of her head, his arm tightening around her. "I love you," he said simply. "Thank you for being brave enough to walk 40 miles through desert. Thank you for not giving up when most people would have. Thank you for choosing me, for building this life with me, for being exactly the partner I needed even though I didn't know it when I proposed." "I love you too," Clara replied, lifting her face to kiss him properly. Samuel made exaggerated gagging noises and Maggie giggled, but neither parent paid them any attention, too focused on each other, on the moment, on the life they'd created against all odds. The sky darkened and the stars emerged, the same stars that had watched Clara stumble through desert, that had witnessed James's tears when he found her, that had seen every moment of joy and struggle and triumph that had followed. The children eventually went inside to bed, but James and Clara stayed on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the familiar sounds of their ranch settling for the night. Clara thought about all the decisions and chances that had led to this moment, the improbable series of events that had brought an Eastern girl and a frontier cowboy together. She thought about the letters that had gone astray, forcing her to make that desert crossing instead of being met safely in Tombstone. She thought about the station master who'd given her water and rough directions, about the moment she'd nearly given up but forced herself to continue. She thought about James opening his door, about the water he'd given her, about the tears on his face as he'd held her, and realized how close he'd come to losing someone he hadn't even known he already loved. Every piece had been necessary, every challenge and difficulty and moment of fear. Remove any single element and they wouldn't be here now, wouldn't have this marriage, these children, this life. It had all been perfectly imperfect, a love story written in dust and tears and stubborn determination. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "How lucky we are," Clara said honestly. "How all the difficult parts were actually blessings in disguise, bringing us to exactly where we're supposed to be." James didn't respond with words, just held her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. This was home, Clara thought with deep contentment. Not a building or a place, but this feeling, this moment, this man beside her and the children sleeping inside. She'd walked 40 miles through desert to find it, had nearly died reaching it, and now she held it every day, precious and irreplaceable. Years would continue passing, bringing new challenges and joys, watching their children grow and eventually start families of their own. The ranch would expand further, becoming one of the more successful operations in the territory. James and Clara would grow old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work, but their love remaining constant, the foundation everything else was built upon. But that was all future still to come. Right now, Clara sat on the porch of the house James had built, wrapped in his arms, listening to the sounds of their ranch, and felt complete satisfaction with the life they'd created. She'd been brave enough to walk 40 miles through desert when most would have turned back. She'd been stubborn enough to survive when dying would have been easier. And she'd been fortunate enough to find a man who'd met her with water and tears, who'd saved her life and then made that life worth saving. "Let's go to bed," James finally said, standing and pulling Clara up with him. "Tomorrow's coming early and we've got a full day ahead." Clara let him lead her inside, pausing at the children's rooms to check on Samuel and Maggie, both sleeping peacefully. Then she and James went to their own room, the room they'd shared for over a decade, the place where they'd loved and fought and made up and dreamed together. They prepared for bed with the comfortable ease of long habit, then climbed beneath the wedding ring quilt that had been on their bed since that first night. James pulled Clara close, and she settled against him with a contented sigh, her body fitting perfectly against his after years of sleeping this way. "Good night, sweetheart," James murmured, already half asleep. "Good night," Clara whispered back and closed her eyes, grateful beyond words for the life that had begun with 40 miles of desert and a cowboy's tears, and had grown into something more beautiful than she'd ever imagined possible. In the morning, they would wake and work and live the life they'd built together. But for now, they simply slept. Two people who'd found each other against impossible odds, who'd created something lasting in harsh country, who'd proven that love could survive anything if both people were willing to fight for it. Clara's 40-mile walk through desert had ended at James's door, but their real journey, the one that mattered, had only just begun in that moment. And now, years later, that journey continued, richer and deeper and more meaningful with every day that passed. The ranch stood solid beneath starlight, a testament to determination and love and stubborn refusal to give up. Inside, a family slept peacefully, safe, and together, the product of one woman's courage and one man's tears and the life they'd built from those raw materials. It was everything Clara had walked 40 miles to find, everything James had prayed for when he'd held her dying on his porch, everything they'd worked for in the years since. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.